Sit still, you piece of trash. I'll shave your head right here for the whole court to see. Officer Kane barked, the buzzing clippers slicing through the air. Echoes of cruel laughter filled the room as strands of Evelyn Carter's hair fell like blades cutting into her dignity. No one moved, no one dared to intervene. Everyone held their breath, watching the peak of humiliation unfold. But just 3 minutes later, the woman stood up, climbed into the highest seat, and cast a cold, piercing stare straight at him. Only then did Kane realize the one he had just humiliated was the presiding judge, and his nightmare was only beginning. The morning at Southridge Courthouse was washed in pale white light from rows of aging neon lamps. The hallway packed tight with bodies, jostling for space shoes pounding on tiled floors, papers, rustling whispers, drifting like a thin layer of smoke. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed. The entire atmosphere sucked into a tension that had long soaked into the faded walls. Cold, hard plastic chairs lined the corridor, filled with bodies in suits, dress shirts, and ties, with a few anxious faces scattered among them waiting for a hearing that might change their lives. In that crowd, a black woman in a blue suit sat silently in a corner, back, straight eyes fixed on the space ahead. Evelyn Carter had placed her small handbag beside her, one hand resting lightly on its strap, fingers curling slightly as if holding a secret. Her calm in the noisy hallway drew a few passing glances, but no one looked long enough to really see her, as if her presence was invisible. The door to courtroom 3 creaked open, and a few lawyers stepped out and exchanged hurried words. Amid the crowd, a large figure appeared, heavy black shoes thudding against the floor. Officer Kane, the security officer on duty that morning, entered with arrogance baked into every movement. His eyes scanned the hallway and stopped where the black woman was sitting, sneering, as if he had just found someone who didn't belong in his territory. He ignored the busy lawyers, didn't care about the clerk clutching a stack of files, his stare like a hooked nail locked onto Evelyn. A crooked, contemptuous smile twitched across his lips as he slowly moved toward her. He stopped in front of her, his large frame blocking the light, and snapped loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "What are you doing here? Someone like you's only fit for mopping floors." His voice carried undisguised venom and insult thrown straight into the middle of the hallway. The air, already heavy, thickened into a dense silence. A few heads turned, then quickly looked away, pretending to focus on their documents. Someone cleared their throat softly, another shifted in their seat, but no one spoke. Evelyn Carter didn't respond. She inhaled slowly, her hand tightening on the bag strap, knuckles paling. She lifted her chin slightly, eyes staying fixed on the air in front of her, as if swallowing the insult, whole letting no reaction escape. Kane folded his arms, looking down at her with a smug grin. He waited for a reply, a flash of anger, something he could use to escalate the moment. But Evelyn's silence only deepened his frustration, like a man poking with a stick and growing furious when no one screams. "Silent, huh? Just like your kind," he muttered, loud enough for the row of seats to catch it. A few whispers stirred someone, gave a small shake of the head, but still no voice rose to cut through his arrogance. Evelyn remained still, but her eyes, weighted like lead, began to rise, not to meet his, but to look through him as if waiting for another moment to speak. In that moment, Kane felt hot blood rush to his face. To him, power meant making others bow, not being treated as invisible. He clenched his jaw, drew a breath, then leaned down, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "Sit there, and in a bit, I'll show this whole court who you really are." His voice wasn't loud, but it cut like a blade slicing cold through the air. Evelyn didn't turn her head, didn't respond. Her hand moved slightly, gripping her handbag tighter, fingers trembling as if holding back her breath from breaking into sound. People in the hallway pretended not to hear, but their eyes began to flicker with stolen glances. A female clerk hurried past, head down, hugging a stack of files, walking faster than usual. A nearby law student took a deep breath, fingers stealthily pulling a phone from his pocket, hiding it under his folder camera, quietly rolling. The shaky little screen captured everything the exact moment when power turned filthy in the very hallway that was supposed to symbolize justice. Kane stayed where he was, his shadow cast long over the woman. He tilted his head, eyes gleaming with a twisted delight as he saw everyone around frozen, too afraid to stop him. To him, collective silence was permission to push further. His lips curled, half smirk, half snarl, and he jerked his chin. "Get up," I said. "Get up." His voice boomed, dragging the atmosphere lower, forcing those around him to witness raw abuse once again. Evelyn Carter still didn't move. Her eyes slowly pulled away from the void and lifted to meet Kane's face. For a moment, in the frozen crowd, her gaze was sharp as a blade. No shouting, no resistance, but not a trace of surrender. It was a stare of waiting, a silent signal that the storm hadn't begun, and those basking in their power would soon pay. But in that moment, to Kane, it was a challenge he couldn't stand. And, like anyone used to abusing power, he was ready to twist that challenge into the excuse for what would come next. The courthouse hallway remained packed, but everything felt frozen. Every passing footstep moved faster and quieter than usual. Every glance slipped away in fear. In that space, power no longer belonged to law, but sat entirely in the hands of a man sneering and threatening, and in the unshakable silence of a woman about to change the course of that courtroom. Kane stepped in closer, his breath carrying the stale scent of early morning cigarettes mixed with the metallic tang of the gun at his hip. He stopped directly in front of Evelyn Carter, one heavy hand landing on her shoulder, the pressure meant to pin her down, then yank her up as proof of dominance. "Stand up, security check," he barked, each word punched out loud enough to drown out the hallway's noise. The space instantly tensed. Footsteps paused for a second before rushing on quicker now, as if everyone wanted to be far away from that spot. Evelyn slowly lifted her face, her eyes fixed on the empty space behind him, not meeting the eyes bearing down with hostility. She stood calmly, spine straight, neither recoiling nor resisting, only gripping her bag tighter until her knuckles turned white. Kane yanked the bag from her hand, the motion so rough the strap scraped her wrist, leaving a red mark. He slammed the bag onto an empty bench nearby, then without pause or permission unzipped it and began pulling out each item like a showman performing for an unseen crowd. The small belongings of a woman, a wallet, notebook, pen, lipstick, a bottle of mineral water, were tossed one by one onto the floor, each landing with a harsh thud that echoed through the hallway. A thin book dropped open, its pages scattering slightly, creating a mess no one dared bend down to fix. "This stuff doesn't belong in a place like this. This is a court, not a night market," Kane sneered, his voice pitched so everyone could hear. His words sliced deep, turning ordinary possessions into weapons of humiliation. A few chuckles slipped from a cluster of officers standing nearby. No one dared laugh aloud, but those smirks were enough to turn the silence of others into complicity. Evelyn bent down, her hands trembling slightly as she calmly picked up each item. She didn't speak. Her composure made Kane's aggression look almost absurd. Every touch of her fingers made a faint clicking sound against the floor, sharp in the hallway's forced quiet. She seemed to be gathering more than scattered belongings. She was reclaiming fragments of dignity trampled in plain sight while the crowd pretended not to see. A female attorney walked past her eyes, brushing the scene before darting away, head lowered as if nothing had happened. A middle-aged man sitting nearby shifted slightly, gripping his briefcase tight, eyes fixed on his shoes. The avoidance spread like a ripple, forming a silent circle around the two. At the center, the arrogant enforcer and the woman enduring in silence. Kane leaned in, eyes locked on Evelyn with the look of someone convinced he held absolute power. He let out a cold chuckle, his voice laced with cruel satisfaction. "See that no one dares open their mouth for you. Around here, I do whatever I want." He jerked his chin toward the spectators as if their silence confirmed his authority. Every gaze kept avoiding his, some pretending pretending to check their phones, others shielding their faces with documents, each small motion adding to the suffocating weight of the scene. Evelyn lifted her head, a flicker of unusual light crossing her eyes. She didn't argue, didn't plead, but that look made Kane pause for a moment. It wasn't the stare of a helpless victim, it was the stare of someone observing, remembering, and waiting. A woman standing on the edge of humiliation, yet refusing to collapse. That quiet strength made Kane's smirk twitch briefly, but he quickly recovered, scoffing as he turned to the crowd. She thinks staying silent will save her, but silence only proves I'm right. A law student sitting in the far corner swallowed hard, the phone in his hand shaking. He was recording every second, the cruel words, the subtle violence, all of it caught inside the frame. His eyes scanned the hallway, fearful but firm, because he knew once this footage surfaced, there would be no taking it back. Evelyn had finally gathered her belongings. She stood tall, placed her bag back where it belonged. Her movements were firm, untouched by collapse. The hallway was dead silent, everyone waiting for Kane's next move, as if the entire space had been pulled into the black hole he'd created. And Kane, drunk on arrogance, believed he had already won, believed she had folded under the weight of his false authority. But beneath that silence, a storm was forming. Not one that would strike now, but when it did, it would tear through every shred of arrogance and illusion Kane clung to. And when that moment came, the ones pretending not to see today would have nowhere left to hide. The air in the hallway thickened after Kane's display of authority. Those standing nearby moved farther away on purpose, and those seated sank deeper into their chairs, pretending to study the papers in their hands. But Kane had no intention of stopping. Under the pale glow of flickering neon lights, he casually reached to his waist and pulled out an object that made a few people flinch. It was a small electric clipper, a tool that belonged in a barber shop, not in a courthouse corridor. The click of the power switch echoed as the metal blades began to spin, releasing a sharp, buzzing sound that sliced through the heavy silence. A few horrified eyes looked up, then immediately dropped, as if simply witnessing this was already a mistake. Kane gripped the clipper tightly, lips curling into a sneer. He leaned down close to Evelyn Carter and spoke with a mocking tone twisted in laughter. "Hair's a mess. Let me clean it up. Where I'm in charge, if the law stays neat, people do too." His words weren't just mockery. They were a sentence passed by someone who believed he had the right to judge. A few younger officers nearby let out stifled giggles, short but heavy like hammers pounding. What dignity the silent woman still held. Evelyn raised her head slightly, eyes glancing around to see the room frozen in avoidance. No voice protested. No hand reached out to stop the absurd act that was moments from unfolding. She closed her eyes, lashes trembling slightly as if hiding the storm of emotion behind them. Her lips pressed together, face tilted to the side, like a woman binding herself to silence, knowing that any reaction would only feed the next humiliation. The metallic blades scraped against her hair with a harsh screech, and strands of black began to fall across the cold white tiles. Each lock hit the floor like an exclamation point, burning itself into the memory of those watching but not moving. The law student in the corner shook uncontrollably, his phone trembling in his hand, yet the camera stayed locked on the scene, capturing what he could not believe was happening inside a courthouse. Kane moved the clippers across her scalp with slow precision, the hum of the motor merging with his heavy breathing as if he were savoring the moment. "There now, that's tidy," he mocked each word, slicing deeper into the tension. The hair kept falling, gathering on her shoulders, sticking to the back of her collar, then pooling across the tile floor like a live exhibit of cruelty. Evelyn remained still, her lips trembling slightly, but no sound escaped. Each passing second dragged like an entire day, and in that silence, her dignity seemed to be torn apart piece by piece. But behind those tightly shut eyes, a quiet fire was burning. She knew every averted gaze she heard, every cruel chuckle she felt, every vibration of the clipper skimming her scalp. She swallowed it all, carving it deep inside herself, waiting for the moment it would erupt into a truth no one could deny. A small strand of hair clung to her forehead, then fell onto the hand resting on her lap. Evelyn opened her eyes, stared straight ahead, her breathing steady, her heartbeat pounding in her chest like war drums. Kane lifted his head, looked around, and seeing the silence unbroken, his arrogance swelled. "See, no one objects. Everyone knows I'm right," he declared, as if the entire hallway had appointed him judge and lawmaker. In a shadowed corner, a middle-aged woman clutched her files tightly, lips trembling as if to speak, but she lowered her head and stayed silent. A young clerk bit her lip until it bled eyes red and glassy, but she too didn't dare to move closer. The collective silence wrapped the hallway like an invisible prison where the one with power could do whatever he pleased and the rest became inmates of their own complicity. Kane finally stopped eyeing the jagged mess he had made of her hair. He smirked, switched off the clippers, the final buzz landing like a sharp crack, leaving behind a choking silence. He shoved the clipper into his pocket, his face smug with triumph, like a man who believed he had just shown the world how easily a person could be reduced to a joke. Evelyn sat motionless, lips quivering, but still silent. A single tear fell down her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. It slid to the cold white tile, a piece of evidence no one could erase. In that silence, those who had watched knew they had just witnessed something beyond the limits of law, beyond the boundaries of basic humanity. But instead of speaking up, they bowed their heads, bracing themselves behind the lie that nothing had happened. And it was that lie, alongside Kane's act of ultimate humiliation, that planted the seed for a reckoning no one would be able to stop once it began. The clipper had stopped, but its echo still lingered in the courthouse hallway like a shrill tear through the air, buzzing faintly in the ears of those who had witnessed it. Evelyn Carter sat there, her hair uneven, a few strands still resting on her shoulders, eyes half closed, her breathing strangely calm as if the humiliation was seeping slowly into her body to harden into a kind of invisible armor. Kane stood beside her, smug expression in place, scanning the room like a man certain he had just won a battle no one dared to challenge. And just as he expected, not a single protest was raised, only clumsy gestures attempting to hide discomfort. A few officers nearby smirked silent grins that said they were entertained. Across the aisle, some attorneys bowed their heads, flipping pages as if their case files had suddenly become urgent eyes locked on the paper, though not a word registered. They didn't do it out of respect for the law, but to save themselves from the guilt of having seen. Kane saw it all. He nodded slowly, then burst into laughter, his voice booming down the hall. "See, the whole room agrees with me. No one's got anything to say because everyone knows you don't belong here. Around here, my voice is the law." The mockery wasn't just aimed at Evelyn. It slapped the entire room silent. His words turned fear into complicity, made every bowed head and averted gaze into confirmation of his fake authority. A heavy air took hold, thick as fog, pressing down until every breath felt weighted. In the far corner of the hallway, a young man sat pressed against the wall, face tense, sweat glistening on his forehead. He was the law student who had been watching from the beginning, his eyes shaky with a desperate search for justice in a room drowning in silence. His hand slipped into his pocket, pulling out a phone, the sweat from his palm slick against its surface. His thumb trembled as he opened the camera, the faint glow from the screen barely visible under the folder he used to hide it. Each heartbeat pounded like it might crack his chest open, but he kept the lens steady, aimed at Kane and Evelyn. He knew the risk, knew the phone might be smashed and he might be dragged out, but the rage building inside him made it impossible to sit still. Kane didn't notice the small movement. He was too caught up in his victory eyes sweeping across the hallway as if savoring the submission on every face. His arrogance swelled, turning the act of humiliation into a performance, and the silence of the crowd became applause. No one dared to look directly at Evelyn. No one dared to look at the scattered strands of hair on the floor, afraid that meeting her eyes would force them to act, and they didn't have the courage to. They chose to pretend not to see, and that very pretense draped draped the hallway in a suffocating veil thick enough to make every breath a burden. Evelyn opened her eyes, stared forward, not at Kane, not at anyone in the crowd. Her face was strangely calm, but in the depths of her gaze lay a promise that today's silence would become tomorrow's evidence. Her lips pressed tight, her expression carved in stone, no more tears falling. She let them all hang their fear on her silence, knowing it would become a blade turned backward, cutting through every accomplice, hiding behind quiet. A faint sigh escaped from the far end of the row, quickly swallowed by the tension, stretched tight like wire. The young man, holding the phone, took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands so the frame wouldn't blur. Every second dragged like an hour, but he knew each one was a precious piece of a larger truth. Meanwhile, Kane stood tall arms folded, face gleaming with self-satisfaction, soaking in a moment he believed would never be challenged. The courthouse space felt buried under a layer of mud where everyone chose to sink just enough to avoid being pulled in. Distant murmurs died out, replaced by a silence so sharp felt haunted. Everyone held their breath, everyone waited, and in that waiting the weak became shields for the strong. Kane inhaled deeply, threw his head back and let out a low, guttural laugh, as if the silence itself was the liquor feeding his ego. Evelyn Carter remained seated back straight, eyes sharp in the thick darkness. She didn't need to say a word because she knew the truth was being recorded, and once that truth broke through the wall of silence, it would strike a fatal blow to the arrogance smothering the room. In that moment, the courthouse was no longer just a waiting room. It had become the first courtroom where every silent bystander was now an unwilling jury forced to witness, forced to choose between today's cowardice and the storm of truth soon to come. And so, the courtroom air grew even heavier. Every breath held the fear compressing into a stone suspended above them all, ready to fall at any moment. Kane remained arrogant, Evelyn remained silent, and the crowd kept pretending not to see, but in the darkness of bowed heads, a small light had sparked from a trembling hand, holding a phone preparing for the moment when truth would break through the wall of silence. Kane stood with his arms crossed beside the long bench, his eyes scanning Evelyn Carter from head to toe as if she had just been reduced to someone beneath contempt. Stray clumps of uneven hair covered the floor, a few strands clinging to her collar, making her image even more offensive in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, sneered, then growled, "Now you look more like a criminal than a witness." The words came out like the final blade he used to seal the humiliation, prompting a few nearby officers to stifle their laughter, while others waiting for their hearings buried their faces deeper into their files, pretending not to hear, pretending not to see. Kane's arrogance poured out through his voice, fully convinced he had total control, that the woman before him would be forever trapped in the scene he had just staged. At that moment, the sound of firm, even footsteps echoed from the end of the hallway, bouncing off the stained brick walls and spreading through the space. Each step made Kane flinch slightly, though he quickly regained composure, arms still crossed, lips curled in a defiant smirk. The crowd held its breath, lifting its heads for a brief second, and then, as if by silent command, the entire hallway fell still. The court clerk stepped forward, a thick folder in hand, and called out clearly, "Presiding judge," entering the courtroom. The air split like a blade. Kane froze slightly, his brows furrowed, eyes scanning for the familiar figure of the usual judge. But instead of a new face entering from the main door, the woman he had just humiliated slowly rose from the bench. Evelyn Carter lifted her bag and set it aside with care, her shoulders trembling faintly, as if shedding the weight of the pain left behind on that seat. She stepped onto the wooden platform, her posture upright, her footsteps steady and unshaken. Her uneven hair still bore the patches of violation, but when she looked ahead, her gaze cut through the room like ice slicing through every stunned face. Kane's eyes widened, the confidence that had filled his body now draining into a hollow emptiness. He wanted to smirk, to mumble something to mask the shift, but his throat locked and no sound emerged. A few nearby officers glanced at one another, their frozen smiles slipping, breathing, quickening as if they had just seen seen the impossible. Lawyers who had buried their faces in paperwork now looked up all at once, their expressions shifting hands, trembling papers spilling to the floor. Evelyn reached the highest seat, the one meant for the person who holds the scales, who delivers the final judgment in that room. She turned, sat down, and placed her hands on the wooden desk, her fingers tapping a calm, even rhythm. Her cold gaze swept across the room, then stopped on Kane's face. Her voice rang out, not loud, not rushed, but every word fell like a hammer. This court is now in session. The courtroom fell silent. The court clerk bowed her head, low hands trembling around the thick file she held. The audience sat with mouths agape, some covering their faces, others leaning back as if facing a storm they could not escape. Kane remained frozen in place, his jaw twitching, eyes darting wildly like a cornered animal. All the arrogance from minutes earlier now recoiled like a slap across his own face. Evelyn's hair may have been unevenly shaved, but that very image made her authority look more formidable than ever. She didn't need to shout or slam a gavel to prove who truly held power in that room. It was the act of stepping up, the quiet weight of sitting in the highest chair that crushed every illusion Kane had wrapped himself in. And when her eyes locked onto him, the truth was undeniable. The woman he had humiliated was the presiding judge, the one with the power to decide the fate of everyone in that courtroom, including his. For several seconds, no one dared to breathe. Every heartbeat in the gallery seemed to echo against the walls, merging into a suffocating rhythm. The law student in the back corner still held his phone, the lens shaking but steady, capturing the exact moment that would later spark national outrage. Kane pulled his hands in, close to the same hands that had rifled through her belongings, now curling awkwardly at his sides as if he had accidentally seated himself in the defendant's chair. The courtroom had transformed in just a few minutes, but the change sliced through the air like a cold blade, turning every moment of earlier silence into a collective indictment. Evelyn Carter sat tall in the judge's chair, her face composed, her voice rising again. "Everyone be seated. This hearing will proceed." In that moment, there was no denying it. What was meant to break her had only made her unshakable in the eyes of all who watched. Kane thought he had won, but the truth was his downfall had begun the second Evelyn stepped onto that bench. Out in the hallway, where people were still whispering about the unexpected twist of Evelyn Carter taking the highest seat, the law student sat curled in a corner, hands still trembling from the adrenaline. In his grip was a phone carrying a bombshell, less than 3 minutes of footage showing Officer Kane switching on the clippers, strands of hair falling, his sneering laughter echoing. His heart pounded like it would explode, but only one question echoed in his head: keep it in the phone or show the world. He took a deep breath, fingers slick with sweat, and pressed the upload button. In that moment, the screen lit up, displaying video successfully uploaded to TikTok. Seconds later, the clip entered the timeline, dancing among thousands of other videos, but this one carried the weight of justice violated. He gave it a short, sharp title: "Cop Humiliates Black Woman in Court." Below it, he typed a few more words: "Who allowed this to happen in a courtroom?" Then he hit enter. He knew from that moment on nothing would ever go back to the way it was. Within the first 10 minutes, the clip had thousands of views, and the comments began pouring in like a storm, some furious, some stunned. "Unbelievable. This is America. In 2025, he must be held accountable." The video was reposted again and again, tagged with calls for justice. As the view count surged into the hundreds of thousands, social media began to erupt. 1 hour later, the clip passed 1 million views. Online news outlets picked it up immediately, pairing it with bold headlines pushed to the top. "Police officer publicly shames black woman in courtroom. Outrage erupts." A freeze frame showed Kane holding the clippers, his crooked smirk frozen in time while Evelyn sat still, eyes closed. The image spread at lightning speed, becoming a symbol of unchecked abuse of power. At the same time, a new hashtag ignited like wildfire: had justice for Carter. Within hours, it rose to the top of trending lists as tens of thousands of users across cities shared it. attaching the tag to demands for justice. On the streets, short videos surfaced of people holding signs, "Justice for Carter, Justice for All." From one quiet corner of a courthouse, the story had become a roar, and social media had turned it into a wave. The law student, now sitting in a cafe a few blocks from the courthouse, stared at his phone as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Notifications kept flashing, comments flooding in, messages from friends pouring through. "Was that really your video? Do you know what you just did?" Part of him was terrified, but another part felt a strange relief because at least the truth was no longer buried in silence. The phone's screen reflected his pale face, but in his eyes was a flicker of light, quiet certainty that he had done the right thing. Across the city, television networks began issuing urgent report. Anchors reading from the ticker, scrolling across the screen, shocking footage. Police officer shaves black woman's head inside courtroom. The images played on a loop paired with analyst commentary, all blending into a chorus of outrage. International news outlets quickly picked up the story, pushing it beyond U.S. borders and turning it into a global issue. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse itself, Evelyn Carter sat in the judge's chair, her face composed beneath stares of fear and disbelief. She didn't yet know how far the video had spread, but she felt the shift in the air, every whisper, every averted glance, signaling that a storm was already raging beyond those walls. Kane, on the other hand, remained oblivious. He stood in the corner, eyes narrowing as he scanned the room, still drunk on the illusion that everything was under his control. But it wouldn't be long before he understood the power of a society that refuses to stay silent. The hashtag Justice for Carter kept climbing. Social media users began sharing personal stories of police abuse, thousands of accounts pouring in, being pulled over for no reason, being interrogated for the color of their skin. Under each post, hundreds of thousands of likes and shares turned the hashtag into a movement. On TikTok, thousands of short clips mocked the hair-buzzing moment with scathing captions. Every time the imaginary clippers passed over someone's head, the word racism flashed across the screen in bold. An hour later, people began flooding the streets of major cities, holding signs that read, "Silence is a crime," and "Carter speaks for all of us." That image spread right back onto social media, feeding the outrage loop, multiplying momentum until nothing could stop it. Kane, still believing he held the upper hand, had no idea that millions of eyes were now watching him, and with each passing second, his arrogance turned into evidence. And Evelyn, the woman publicly humiliated, now stood as a symbol of a rising fight. From a 3-minute video, the story of a city had turned a new page in history. The news spread like wildfire through a dry forest. From the 3-minute video uploaded to TikTok, mainstream media immediately jumped in. Television networks broke into regular programming with breaking news. On screen appeared the image of Kane holding the clippers, his smug smirk on full display, while Evelyn Carter sat motionless, her hair crudely shaved. The anchor spoke slowly and firmly. An unthinkable scene inside the courtroom of Southridge County. A police officer publicly humiliated a black woman in the middle of a trial, and the twist that stunned the nation, she was Judge Evelyn Carter. The footage, replayed on loop, holding millions in place, outrage swelling like a crashing wave. Outside Southridge Police Headquarters, crowds began forming early the next morning. They carried large signs, bold black letters on a white backgrounds, "Silence is Complicity." The slogan echoed in waves, chants, rising and rolling, thundering through the street. Elderly residents, young adults, students, and even parents with children stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions grave. Police were ordered to set up barricades, but the higher the fences went, the louder the chants roared like a challenge. Truth will not be contained. Reporters pressed forward, cameras rolling non-stop, broadcasting live as hundreds gathered before the black iron gates of the station. Meanwhile, Kane, instead of staying quiet, poured fuel on the growing fire. He opened his phone, went live from his living room wearing a smug grin. The screen wobbled as he held the phone up, his voice sharp with defiance. "It was just a haircut, nothing more. I was keeping order. That crowd's just putting on a show." He tilted his chin, took a long drag from his cigarette, narrowed his eyes, and smirked into the lens, thinking his dismissive tone would calm the backlash. But the social media storm didn't calm it, exploded. Within minutes, thousands of furious comments flooded the live stream. "Racist thug. He thinks this is a joke. Justice died at the hands of people like him." Angry emojis, crying faces, and raised fists filled the comment section. Some users clipped and reposted the live stream, pairing it with the original video to form a damning chain of evidence showcasing Kane's arrogance. With each passing second, the wave of outrage surged higher. Independent journalists and social activists shared the story alongside calls to take to the streets, emphasizing that this was no longer just a personal incident, but a wake-up call for a system riddled with abuse of power. New hashtags appeared next to hashtag Justice for Carter, Silence is Complicity, End Police Abuse. People filmed themselves printing slogans on shirts, painting them on walls, even spraying red letters in front of the police station. "Carter, we stand with you." Kane looked at his phone screen, watching the view count climb into the tens of thousands. But instead of the support he expected, all he saw were messages of fury. His brow furrowed slightly, but he forced a mocking smile and said, "Go ahead, scream all you want. I'm still here, still a cop. No one can touch me." He flicked ash onto the floor and confidently ended the live stream. But out there, every word he had just spoken was clipped, replayed, and turned into fuel for thousands of videos analyzing and condemning him. Each arrogant line only made the crowd more furious. By evening, footage of the protests filled the screens of major news networks. Anchors remarked, "A police officer mocked justice and dared the public to respond." What he doesn't realize is the community is turning his arrogance into the fire behind their resistance. In the background, thousands held signs reading, "Silence is Complicity," cutting between those images and the cold, steady face of Evelyn Carter on the judge's bench. That contrast left viewers at home feeling something deeper. Something in society was shifting. Across other cities, from New York to Los Angeles, from Chicago to Houston, people also took to the streets. Every protest was live-streamed, hashed Justice for Carter covering every feed. Celebrities, actors, musicians, and athletes all spoke out condemning Kane's actions and demanding immediate disciplinary response. A famous basketball player posted a brief statement, "Today it's Carter. Tomorrow it could be anyone." Enough, that line was shared millions of times, turning it into the rallying cry of an entire movement. What began as a moment of personal humiliation had become a national movement where millions found a collective voice. They no longer saw just Kane. They saw the system that allowed him to smirk in the middle of a courtroom. And in that rage, one truth became impossible to ignore. The haircut was never just an insult. It was a symbol of bias, of arrogance, of dangerous complicity. Evelyn Carter, silent in her moment of humiliation, had now become the center of a nation screaming for justice. Before the outrage could subside, major news networks jumped in, treating the Kane incident as an unprecedented flashpoint. A prime-time talk show invited him on to clarify the events. The studio door swung open, and Kane walked in with his usual confident shirt, button-tight tie, knotted perfectly, his face arranged into a look of calm control. He took the guest seat cameras, blazing the live audience around him, silent, waiting to hear his explanation. The host began in a steady voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Officer Kane, the man seen in the viral courtroom video. "Do you have anything to say about your actions that day?" Kane nodded slightly, leaned toward the microphone, his tone tinged with sarcasm, as if to suggest the public had overreacted. She was just a witness. "I did what I did to maintain order in the courtroom to prevent chaos. Online people cut things up, exaggerate, and distort the story." His words came slowly and deliberately, each one positioned like a sandbag to hold back the flood of public backlash. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some frowned, others crossed their arms, their faces clearly unsettled. The host didn't argue. He simply raised an eyebrow and pressed a button on the remote. On the large screen behind Kane, the video began to play. The sound filled the studio, the sharp buzzing of clippers, Kane's mocking laugh, and Evelyn Carter sitting frozen as chunks of her hair fell onto the cold floor. The room gasped in unison. Audible breaths tightened. A woman in the audience lifted her hand to her mouth, eyes glassy with tears. The camera zoomed in on Kane's face, and the composure he had clung to began to crack. Sweat formed on his forehead, his hands gripped the armrests, and his eyes darted away from the screen. The host turned to him, voice suddenly cold. "You said she was a witness, but the full video shows she didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't move, and you shaved her head anyway. Do you deny that?" Kane tried to force a smile, his lips tightening. "That was how I handled the situation. I thought she wasn't complying. I did it for the greater good." His defense stumbled out flimsy and broken, falling flat into the charged silence of the room. And then the studio door opened, and footsteps echoed clearly across the floor. Every audience member turned their head, the spotlight beaming directly onto the walkway. Evelyn Carter appeared dressed in a sharp suit, her hair now neatly cropped after the shaving, but her eyes were colder and sharper than ever. She walked with steady steps to the center of the stage. The audience rose to their feet, applause erupting like thunder, drowning out the heavy atmosphere. Kane turned toward the sound, his eyes wide with panic, as if staring into a nightmare. Evelyn stopped beside the round table, facing Kane directly. Her voice rang out even and precise, every word sharp. "You just shaved the head of the presiding judge." The sound echoed across the studio, falling like a verdict that could not be appealed. No murmurs, no gasps, just stunned silence as every eye locked onto Kane. The camera zoomed in, capturing his pale face, his trembling lips drained of all color. No one in the studio would forget that moment. Evelyn Carter, once treated with disdain, now stood in the spotlight as a symbol of unbreakable justice. Kane, the man who thought he controlled the rules, was exposed before millions with no escape left. And that confrontation, broadcast live across the nation, turned the story into a full-blown storm, sweeping away every illusion of power he had clung to. The moment Evelyn Carter stood beneath the studio lights facing millions of viewers, the air grew so still that even the hum of the cameras could be heard. Kane sat frozen, his face pale, eyes darting in search of sympathy but meeting only fury. Before the host could speak, Evelyn stepped forward, her voice steady, low, and cold. "I stayed silent to see how you would behave." The sentence dropped like a blade, exposing the cowardice of those who had stood by in the hallway and ripping open Kane's smug facade. No lengthy defense was needed, her one line cut straight into everyone's conscience, turning silence into a mirror, reflecting the bitter truth. In an instant, the studio erupted. Thunderous applause shook the room, the audience rising as one, chants of "Carter, Carter" echoing from every corner. Cameras swept across the crowd, capturing glowing faces, fists raised high, eyes glistening with tears. The sound surged through televisions into living rooms, cafes, and dorms, making even distant viewers feel as if they were there, part of the collective reckoning. Evelyn did not raise her hand to quiet them, nor did she smile. She stood still amid the roar, eyes locked on Kane. It wasn't a look of defiance, it was the gaze of someone who had chosen truth as her only weapon. She let the chance speak for her, let the applause carry the weight of what needed to be said. In that sound, yesterday's silence was finally paid for, replaced by a unity that could no longer be ignored. Kane tried to move his lips, twitching, as if to explain, but each attempt was drowned out by another surge of Carter. The camera caught every drop of sweat tracing down his face. The crowd outside was turning him into the symbol of arrogance and abuse, and he knew no words could save him now. The image of a once proud officer shrinking under public rage became a living testament to his downfall. Finally, the host spoke, his voice clear and firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, the truth is undeniable. We didn't just witness a viral moment, we saw a community choose silence, and one woman turn that silence into evidence." He gestured toward Evelyn, and the room exploded again in applause. She gave a small nod, eyes burning with resolve. She hadn't needed many words to force a nation to reflect, to make them confront the question. If there hadn't been a phone, if she hadn't been a judge, how many more would remain buried in the silence? That moment didn't stay confined to the studio. Outside, giant screens in public squares broadcast the footage live, hundreds stopping to watch, then erupting in applause as Evelyn spoke. In a small bar, customers clinked their glasses to the rhythm, shouting her name. In a crowded dorm room, students huddled in front of a laptop cheering as if watching a championship game. The eruption spread, turning one moment on television into a full-blown social event. Kane sat with his head bowed, his eyes avoiding contact, but the cameras missed nothing, zooming in on his stunned expression. Online, the image of Kane across from Evelyn quickly became a new symbol. One side, a face of broken arrogance, the other calm defiance. The hashtag #CarterResists began trending, joining others already in motion, pushing public momentum into an even fiercer storm. Evelyn stepped closer to the camera, her voice calm but clear enough for millions to hear. "It's time to end the silence. It's time for people to rise." She turned the spotlight, catching the rough edges of her short hair, and that image imprinted itself on the memory of viewers as a symbol of resilience. From that moment forward, she was no longer just a judge on the bench. She had become the voice of millions yearning for justice. Kane sat frozen, like a man cornered, his face pale, forehead slick with sweat. He stammered, lips moving but unable to form a complete sentence. His panicked eyes swept the room from the rows of spectators to the cameras locked on him, then dropped to the floor as if searching for a way out. Every twitch, every movement was exposed by the stage lights. There was no darkness left to hide in. He tried to adjust his tie, but the awkward gesture only made his collapse more obvious, the once confident shell around him now visibly torn. Silence pressed in from hundreds of eyes staring at him, a suffocating weight that left Kane with nothing but a clenched jaw, swallowing the lump lodged in his throat. Outside the studio, the tension showed no signs of easing. The live broadcast captured every second, and international media quickly followed. The BBC opened with a shot of Kane stiff in his seat facing Evelyn Carter, the headline scrolling beneath U.S. police officer humiliates black judge. Global outrage erupts. CNN followed with a hard punch, abuse of power exposed on live TV. In Paris, the national evening news aired footage of Evelyn with her jagged haircut, viewers murmuring in disbelief. In Tokyo, Japanese anchors highlighted the courtroom context, calling it a slap to the face of American justice. Clips of Kane, stammering, unable to speak, were edited and shared non-stop. Within hours, a short video of him frozen in silence after Evelyn's statement flooded Twitter and TikTok. Headlines across digital news sites screamed, "The humbler, now humiliated." The contrast fueled the crescendo. Public focus had shifted from the act of shaving her head to the collapse of a man who once believed himself untouchable. In newsrooms, even seasoned editors admitted they had never seen a public official fall so fast, so visibly, and so completely on live television. In major public squares, LED screens replayed Kane's trembling face, while crowds cheered and clapped each time the image appeared. In New York, Times Square lit up with digital banners reading, "Stand with Carter." In Berlin, hundreds gathered outside the Parliament building holding signs in German that translated to "Silence is Complicity." International coverage moved beyond reporting, it became analysis. Networks questioned the systems that allowed someone like Kane to operate unchecked and the silence of those in that courtroom who enabled him. Kane sat silently as the host pressed on with questions, but his voice cracked, his answers broken. I didn't. What I meant was, I was just doing my job," he mumbled, but jeers and whistles from the audience drowned him out. His humiliation was no longer personal. It had become a global image. Legal analysts appearing on international broadcasts argued that Evelyn Carter had shown the world the face of abuse of power, not through legal documents, but through an undeniable scene burned into public memory. Every clip, every headline, every comment became a mirror reflecting Kane's reality. He could look away from the studio lights, but he couldn't hide from the millions watching outside. And as global news outlets continued their coverage, the truth had moved far beyond the borders of one city. It had become a global echo, making clear that this time denial was pointless, because the whole world had seen. Just as the public outcry showed no signs of dying down, a new video clip leaked online, sending shockwaves through an already reeling nation. Unlike the original wide-angle footage, this one appeared to have been filmed from a low angle, likely by someone sitting nearby. The image shook slightly, the lighting was dimmer, but the detail was chilling. The lens captured the exact moment Kane pressed the clippers against Evelyn Carter's scalp. The metal blades whirring just millimeters from her skin, the mechanical hum painfully loud. In the frame, his face twisted with satisfaction, lips curled into a smirk, eyes gleaming with pleasure as he watched her endure the humiliation. Viewers could see the slight twitch in her shoulder, the trembling of her hands resting on her lap, but she made no resistance, letting it happen in silence. The clip lasted less than 30 seconds, but it carried more weight than any testimony. Whatever Kane had denied during his televised appearance crumbled instantly. There was no room for excuses, no possible spin. If the first video left him a thread to claim he was maintaining order, this one tore that away completely. It revealed a deliberate act of violence entirely unrelated to duty. Social media exploded, each comment a blow. This is the undeniable truth. His actions confessed everything. Kane isn't a cop, he's a criminal. Major news outlets quickly joined the frenzy. Networks aired the new footage on loop, some even slowing it down to highlight the cruelty on Kane's face. One anchor stated firmly, "This moment isn't about a mistake or misjudgment. It's a blatant abuse of power." From Washington to Los Angeles, Paris to Seoul, evening broadcasts were filled with images of Kane holding clippers to the head of a woman the world now knew was a presiding judge. The horror spreading through public consciousness knew no borders. Inside the Southridge Police Department, the atmosphere was shaken. Younger officers whispered in the halls, quietly admitting the evidence was too clear to deny. Civil rights attorneys immediately filed motions to the state's highest court demanding Kane's suspension. Outside, protesters raised their phones, playing the clip on repeat, projecting it onto walls as chants thundered through crowded squares. Carter deserves justice. In a closed room, Kane sat staring at his laptop screen, his face pale. The video played on a loop, his expression shifting from arrogance to panic, but it was far too late. The evidence had already spilled everywhere, pouring into news reports, seeping through comment sections, becoming a sentence without needing a court. Kane could stay silent, could try to hide, but the truth was already exposed, and there was nowhere left for him to disappear. As the second clip went viral worldwide, every excuse Kane had offered became meaningless. Within hours, a suspension order was issued, and he was instructed to surrender all weapons, his badge, and his ID. The scene of Kane leaving the precinct, his face-tight hands gripping a small box of personal items, was captured by dozens of news cameras. He walked quickly through a sea of protesters gathered outside the gates, red-lettered signs screaming, "Kane is guilty," striking him in the face. Some shouted his name, hurling insults into the air, while reporters crowded in microphones nearly touching his chin. But Kane kept his head down, silent. His steps were heavy, stripped of the swagger he once wore in the courthouse hallway. News of Kane's suspension spread instantly, replayed across every evening broadcast as the first turning point in his unraveling. But public focus didn't stop there. A larger question had surfaced: how had someone like him been allowed to operate unchecked for years? That question turned scrutiny toward the entire Southridge Police Department. Suddenly, the entire system was dragged into the spotlight, becoming the subject of an unofficial investigation by both the media and the public. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was so heavy that each footstep echoed like an accusation. Many officers were called into emergency meetings, questioned about why no one had intervened during the incident in court. Some tried to deflect, claiming they didn't fully understand the situation, and others remained silent, but their anxious eyes and trembling hands betrayed their fear. Independent investigators were brought in, moving between offices, taking notes, requesting old files, shaking the institution like a disturbed hive. Outside, the public didn't miss the chance to apply pressure. Hundreds continued gathering at the gates, chanting "Justice for Carter" for hours on end. Social activists set up screens replaying the moment Kane was suspended, turning it into living proof that justice could still be reached, but also a reminder that it wasn't enough because an entire system still had to answer. In the media, officer faces began appearing one by one, with reporters digging up long-forgotten case files, raising a series of alarming questions. In the long hallways of the Southridge Police Department, whispers cut through the air like knives. Who's getting called out next? Many grew anxious, some quietly removed personal photos from their desks, and others contacted lawyers in case they were summoned. The air, once thick with the confidence of authority, now brimmed with unease and suspicion. The crisis had grown beyond one man named Kane. It had become a quake, shaking the foundations of the entire institution. And with the door to investigation wide open, no one could say how many more names would be dragged into the light. But everyone understood that this reckoning wouldn't end with just one badge taken away. After the suspension order was issued and public pressure continued to mount, the Department of Justice quickly announced the formation of a special investigative task force. This group included seasoned prosecutors, federal investigators, and members of the Police Oversight Commission. The day they arrived at Southridge headquarters, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Dark suits, thick folders, and their cold stares made the already tense hallways feel suffocating. Recording devices clicked on pens, tapped steadily, and every move, every word from the officers was under scrutiny. These were no longer polite inquiries. Every detail was treated as potential evidence in a full-scale investigation. As they began combing through case files, the team uncovered a string of past complaints against Kane that had been quietly buried in the system. Reports of excessive force, records of unlawful traffic stops, even formal accusations of abuse during interrogations were all tucked away in drawers, each stamped with the chilling phrase, "insufficient evidence." One investigator flipped through the documents, frowning as he saw the approving signatures of superior officers, signaling that multiple people within the department had participated in covering things up. News of the discovery leaked immediately, and headlines exploded. Kane's misconduct wasn't first. The system protected him for years. Inside the department, veteran officers began to panic. They knew that once the files were opened, not just Kane, but those who shielded him would be exposed. Fear spread quickly. Some tried deleting old emails, erasing traces, but the federal database allowed no such thing to go unnoticed. Every piece of data was recovered, and each line in every old report became a rope tightening around those who once believed they were untouchable. Outside, the public followed every development closely. News outlets provided constant updates, and every new revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. People began to understand that Kane's actions were just the tip of the iceberg, beneath which lay a network of enablers. Citizens gathered outside City Hall, holding signs demanding full disclosure of records and public hearings for those involved in the cover-up. Outrage was no longer aimed at at one man. It had become a demand for total reform. After days of silence, Evelyn Carter appeared at a press conference, her face calm but her voice firm. The truth doesn't stop at one video. It lives in every buried case file, in every decision to overlook wrongdoing. This is the moment for justice to shine light on those shadows. Her statement was broadcast across major networks, quoted repeatedly, and became a rallying cry for the street protests. The chant, "Justice for Carter," now carried a broader demand, justice for all. The deeper the Department of Justice dug, the darker the truth became. Kane was not the only one, and it was the system's silence over the years that enraged the public most. Yellowed case files, redacted lines, each fragment now served as evidence, forcing an entire agency to face justice. Journalists raced to investigate, piecing together Kane's past. Old records resurfaced, and long-buried stories were brought back to light. A local paper revealed an incident from 4 years prior, when a 16-year-old black student was arrested by Kane outside his school for lacking a reflector on his bicycle. Witnesses recalled the boy being shoved to the pavement, his face scraped and punched repeatedly in the stomach and back despite pleading for help. The report labeled it necessary restraint, and the family's complaints were dismissed for lack of evidence. The story spread again with photos of the boy's injuries, flooding social media, turning into vivid proof of Kane's brutality. In the days that followed, a wave of investigative reports emerged. A respected magazine released internal documents showing Kane had repeatedly falsified evidence to convict innocent people. A restored email note revealed he once altered a traffic accident report to fabricate drug possession charges. Witnesses recounted how Kane would lower his voice to intimidate them, forcing signatures on pre-written statements. These weren't rumors, they came with documents, signatures, and sworn declarations in Kane's own handwriting. News anchors read the revelations aloud like a formal indictment, each word fueling public outrage. The pressure no longer centered solely on Kane, it spread across the entire NYPD. Major newspapers asked the hard questions: why weren't these incidents addressed, and who signed off to make them disappear? Reporters tracking the files found that many of Kane's superiors had played roles in softening accusations and shelving complaints to protect the department's image. The exposed truth became a blade turned inward, punishing not just a single officer, but dragging an entire institution before the public eye. On a live analysis broadcast, a veteran journalist emphasized, Kane is just the surface. What's being exposed isn't simply one man's misconduct, but a systemic complicity that has lasted for years. His words were clipped into a short video and spread rapidly. Images of senior NYPD officers being named on national television became the center of controversy, forcing them to defend themselves at tense press conferences. But instead of calming the public, each appearance only fueled another wave of outrage as people had grown tired of evasive language. International human rights organizations stepped in, demanding full transparency of all police misconduct records from the past decade. They stressed that if an officer like Kane could escape accountability so many times, the problem wasn't just him, but a deeply flawed oversight mechanism. What should have been supervision had become a shield for abusers. On public forums, citizens compared the NYPD to a rotting wall, polished on the outside, but cracked all the way through at its core. Inside emergency meetings, NYPD leadership faced overwhelming pressure, tasked with common internal ranks while confronting external scrutiny. The press watched their every move, each decision, each answer. Young officers stood quietly in hallways, eyes fixed on the news streaming from their phones, torn between loyalty to the profession and fear that they too would be stained by the legacy of men like Kane. And so the truth was no longer just words buried in case files. It had become a visible fracture running through an entire institution, forcing the NYPD to confront itself and answer whether justice could still stand on a foundation already crumbling beneath it. As news reports continued to expose the dark corners of Kane's past, many who had once remained silent began to find the courage to step into the light. A middle-aged black woman appeared in a live interview, her voice trembling but her gaze firm. She recounted an incident from years ago when Kane stopped her in front of a supermarket. Based on baseless suspicion, he searched her purse and loudly accused her of being a cheap thief in front of a crowd. When she protested, he used the excuse of obstructing law enforcement to take her into custody, detaining her for hours without a single piece of evidence. The humiliation haunted her for years, making her stay silent, believing no one would trust an ordinary woman over a police officer. But now, in front of the camera, she looked straight into the lens and said, "I endured it, and I know I'm not the only one. It's time the truth is told." Her words left the studio in silence, many nodding quietly, and on social media, the interview spread like wildfire. Soon after, another man came forward to share his experience. He was a taxi driver, an immigrant once pulled over by Kane without cause on a rainy night. He had just picked up a passenger from the airport when Kane signaled him to stop. Kane ordered him out, checked his documents, then sneered, "People like you driving here is a real nuisance." Kane tried to accuse him of illegal taxi operation despite all paperwork being in order. The passenger in the back seat witnessed everything but backed out of testifying, afraid of trouble. The driver nearly lost his license until a volunteer lawyer stepped in to help. Now, sitting in front of the camera, no longer hiding, he spoke with steady force. "I stayed silent too long, but silence only makes people like him stronger. Today I want to say that I was a victim too." Those two testimonies were like two more blades, slicing into Kane's already fractured image, while also opening the door for many more to come forward. Reporters noted that in the days that followed, the investigation hotline received hundreds of calls. People who had been stopped by Kane, insulted for their skin color, or threatened in interrogation rooms now saw a chance to speak. Many cried as they spoke, years of suppression lifted by the hope that justice could be found in collective truth. Television networks aired back-to-back talk shows where ordinary people appeared to share their personal experiences. Each story didn't just accuse one man, but reflected a bitter reality. Power had long been used as a tool of oppression rather than protection. Online communities erupted once more, and the hashtag #WeAreAllWitnesses emerged, serving as a declaration that no one was alone, that every voice added another brick in rebuilding the wall of justice. Under growing pressure, the Southridge Police Department could no longer remain evasive. A spokesperson was forced to hold a press conference pledging to investigate all allegations related to Kane and urging victims to come forward. But the statement only intensified public outrage because everyone knew that without the video, these stories would have remained buried. Protesters on the streets raised signs that read, "We are witnesses. We will not stay silent." In those chants, the truth was no longer the burden of a single person. It had become a collective force, pushing society toward change. The continued emergence of new witnesses sent shockwaves through public discourse. One testimony after another piled up like an indictment, heavy enough to stand without a courtroom. People began using the hashtag #StopKane, which started with a few hundred posts but quickly surged into the hundreds of thousands and spread internationally. Each post carried the same message: it was time to end the arrogance and violence Kane represented. Those who once stayed quiet now spoke in unison, writing that silence was complicity and speaking up was a duty. Artists, journalists, and even typically cautious politicians joined in each statement, adding fuel to a fire already blazing. Social media became a public trial. Old clips, images, and documents related to Kane resurfaced and were shared at lightning speed. Some reposted dismissed complaints with sarcastic captions like, "They said there was no evidence, but this is the truth they buried." Others shared photos of injuries from past incidents, edited side by side with Kane's smirking face on TV, creating a contrast that enraged anyone who saw it. The more content surfaced, the clearer the new portrait became. Not a peacekeeping officer, but a repeat abuser who had evaded accountability for years. Live stream analyses ran non-stop, drawing tens of thousands of viewers at once. Activists sat in front of cameras reading documents aloud and explaining how the system had enabled and protected Kane. One detailed breakdown of the police disciplinary process was shared over 1 million times, exposing the loopholes that allowed people like him to remain in uniform. Viewers flooded the comment sections, each message like a gavel strike. No place left for someone like him. Justice must be rebuilt. The outrage wasn't just in the words, it became cartoons, parody songs, and reenactment clips of Kane holding the clippers, this time with bold red letters flashing, "Stop Kane." These pieces of content spread faster than official news reports, turning his image into a bitter global joke. Some analysts argued that it was the internet's creativity that ensured Kane's disgrace would never fade, because it followed him into every corner of the digital world. In discussion groups, people began sharing personal stories of being stopped by police simply for their skin color or appearance. They used #StopKane to add their voices, turning Kane from an individual into a symbol of something much bigger. Social media stopped being just entertainment. It became a collective courtroom where every witness, every voice contributed to putting the system on trial. Every account spread further, every image blown up, forcing society to confront the truth through the glow of a phone screen. Under that pressure, officials could no longer stay silent. Several lawmakers announced plans to hold public hearings and demanded the full release of records related to Kane and those who had protected him. The call gained hundreds of thousands of supporters in just hours. The hashtag #StopKane was no longer aimed at a single man, but had become the shared voice of a community demanding transparency. And in that storm, Kane went from a smug officer to the target of mass condemnation, while social media turned into a massive mirror, reflecting all the long-buried truths, forcing everyone to look them in the eye. The day of Kane's official trial arrived, and the Southridge courtroom was packed. Unlike the time he once walked through the hallway with arrogance today, Kane was escorted in, wearing a gray prison uniform, wrists bound by gleaming handcuffs. The crowd fell silent as he entered. Murmurs spread briefly but faded quickly when every eye turned toward the bench. On the raised platform sat Evelyn Carter, back straight, face calm, eyes sharp as ever. That silence alone turned the courtroom into a place where Kane had no escape left. Kane was ordered to sit at the defendant's table, now directly facing Carter. His eyes met hers, but darted away instantly, lacking the courage to hold her gaze. A flicker of unease crossed his face as he twisted his cuffed hands as though the metal was squeezing out the last of his former arrogance. The air was suffocating, and each soft strike of Carter's gavel signaled the start of the trial. Everyone stood, then sat down in unison, creating a solemn rhythm so unlike the chaos Kane had once inflicted. The prosecutor stepped forward, holding a thick folder, voice steady like an indictment etched in stone. "Defendant Kane, you are charged with abuse of power, assault on a witness, racial discrimination, and intimidation of civilians." With each charge read aloud, the room stirred with murmurs of outrage, then fell quiet to listen. Every accusation was like a brick hurled at the shell Kane once wore, stripping away the false image he had built. Cameras broadcast it live, and outside millions watched, witnessing the long-awaited reversal. Kane's lawyer tried to interject, recycling tired arguments that his client was only doing his duty, that all actions were in the name of public safety. But the prosecutor immediately countered with evidence: the video of Kane pressing clippers to Carter's head witness testimonies from those he had humiliated and buried complaint files. Together, they stacked into a mountain of undeniable proof. The lawyer faltered, voice shaking, while Kane sat motionless, eyes, downcast lips, pressed tight. Gone was his former defiance. Only sheer helplessness remained. The courtroom held its breath to hear more tension drawn tight like a storm waiting to explode. As the prosecutor finished the charges, Carter looked down from the bench, her voice calm and cold. "This trial is not only to judge one man, but to remind us that justice does not belong to the powerful, it belongs to the truth." The words shook the entire room. People inhaled deeply. A few eyes filled with tears, and Kane trembled, knowing the path ahead was no longer an escape, it was a descent into the abyss. The trial continued with a steady stream of testimonies. Each witness who took the stand exposed another slice of the past, from the student who was beaten to the taxi driver who was humiliated, all recounting their experiences under the gaze of the public. The image of Kane, sitting helplessly at the center of the courtroom, formed a stark contrast, turning him from someone who once instilled fear into a figure of public contempt. Outside the courthouse, chants of justice for Carter echoed through, merging with the gavel's rhythmic strikes, forming a unified chorus declaring that this time justice would not be buried. The whole society was watching, and in that moment Kane was no longer an arrogant officer. He was now a defendant in full view, judged under the spotlight, face to face with the woman he once thought he could humiliate. Carter sat high on the bench, needing neither fury nor shouting, because her presence alone was the heaviest sentence upon him. The tables had turned, and no force was strong enough to stop the truth now. After the prosecutor finished speaking, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Every eye turned to the bench where Evelyn Carter sat upright, hands clasped on the wooden surface. Light from the window cast sharp lines across her face, revealing steely features. Kane tried to maintain composure, but beads of sweat slid down his temples. He pressed his lips tight, eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the sharp gaze of the judge he once tried to disgrace. The tension stretched thin like a string about to snap, and just then Carter spoke, her voice low but resonant. "The law is for everyone, including you." The words dropped into the packed courtroom like a hammer striking stone. Not shouted yet, powerful enough to pierce straight through. The audience collectively looked up, some clenched their jaws, others murmured, "That's right," while a few gave firm nods as if to echo her words. Memories of the viral video. The image of Kane holding clippers to Carter's head surged back in that moment, making it clear they were witnessing a reversal of history from a disregarded victim. She now sat there representing justice, forcing the man who once shamed her to listen to judgment. Kane flinched, his eyes, darting chest rising and falling as though he'd inhaled a cold gust of air. He wanted to respond, to blurt out a protest, but his throat was locked. Carter's sentence wasn't long, but every word hooked into him, dragging him out from behind years of protected silence and laying him bare before the public. He bowed his head, but his cuffed hands trembled lightly on his lap, betraying the unraveling storm within. In the audience, murmurs began to rise, emotions swelling like a wave. An elderly woman wiped away tears, a young student raised a fist into the air, scattered applause rang out, and quickly built into a roaring round. The sound surged, making the room seem to tremble. Even those who had remained composed couldn't hold back. They felt Carter's brief statement wasn't just directed at Kane, but at everyone who had ever believed power could stand above the law. The court clerk struck the gavel several times to restore order, but the charged atmosphere couldn't be suppressed. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed without pause. They knew this was a moment that would be remembered for years. A major newspaper was first to post the headline online, "Carter, the law is for everyone, including you." Within minutes, the quote spread everywhere, shared like a rallying banner. The entire courtroom was shaken, not only by the sharpness of the declaration, but because it laid bare the core truth. The man who once walked in, cloaked in false authority, now sat in the defendant's chair, while the woman he had humiliated now held the power to judge. The reversal was so stark it made everyone shudder. Those present realized this was not just a trial, but a profound reminder that the law was never meant to serve the few. It was meant to bind everyone from ordinary citizens to those who once wore uniforms of power. In Carter's eyes, there was no anger, only the resolve of someone who placed absolute faith in justice. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was carrying out duty, turning the humiliation she once endured into a weapon to prove the law still held meaning. And as her words echoed through the room, everyone understood that Kane had truly lost, not just because of the overwhelming evidence, but because the spirit of justice had been affirmed before him with a single sentence that would haunt him forever. Before the trial even concluded, those who had stood on the sidelines were dragged into the spotlight. Prosecutors released a list of officers summoned to testify, including familiar faces from the video showing Carter's head being shaved by Kane. They hadn't laid a hand on her, but the footage clearly captured them standing by with arms crossed, some even laughing their eyes, indifferent as if watching a performance. Their names were read aloud in court, and one by one they walked to the witness stand, heads lowered, faces pale. Another video was played by the prosecution recovered from a hallway security camera that day. The zoomed-in footage showed a young officer leaning over to laugh with a colleague as the sound of the clippers buzzed while another nodded in approval. None of them stepped in to stop it, and no reports were made. That silence and those smiles now stood as damning evidence of complicity. The courtroom stirred with outrage, and online the clip spread instantly with the caption, "This isn't helplessness, this is a choice." The summoned officers tried to defend themselves, claiming they didn't understand the situation or were simply following orders. But the prosecutor countered, firmly pointing at each slowed frame, emphasizing that the act occurred openly, unmistakably. His voice rang clear. Justice does not accept cowardice as an excuse. Here, silence is complicity. The statement echoed through the room, branding those who thought they could dodge responsibility as the second line of offenders. Evelyn Carter sat high on the bench watching each witness approach. Her gaze held no hatred, only resolve, a quiet assertion that justice would spare no one. She had once sat in that same courtroom humiliated amid collective silence. Now it was those who had chosen silence who faced the consequences. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Some nodded in agreement, others shook their heads in disbelief. They understood now that the tragedy wasn't born of one man alone, but of an entire group that turned away. The media jumped on the revelations, placing the summoned officers on front pages, contrasting their past smirks with their present hollow stares. A major headline read, "Complicit in silence, the faces behind Kane." Social media kept the momentum alive, reposting video clips with calls for systemic reform demanding accountability not just from Kane, but from the entire structure that protected him. New hashtags emerged, building on Justice for Carter, this time focused on responsibility, break the silence. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was as tense as a brewing storm. Those who had once stood with Kane now found themselves unwilling witnesses exposed by former colleagues. The unveiling of the truth shook the image of an entire force, leaving many in the gallery visibly unsettled. Carter finally struck the gavel, her voice clear and firm. Justice does not stop at the one who acts. It must reach those who choose to stand and watch. Her words closed the day's hearing, but their aftershock spread wide, making it clear that the truth had no more hiding place, and the accomplices in the shadows had been dragged into the light. As the footage replayed and evidence of complicity came to light, sentences for the involved officers followed swiftly. Some were dismissed immediately, their names struck from the service rolls with a cold, single-sheet decision. Uniforms that once symbolized pride became burdens returned in disgrace. Some left headquarters with lowered eyes, others buried their heads in their hands, and a few tried to salvage their dignity by announcing their resignation. But those found to have actively covered up wrongdoing had no escape. They were prosecuted for obstructing justice, complicity in abuse of power, and violations of professional conduct. New case files, opened names were called one by one to the stand. their faces exposed under the glare of public scrutiny. The atmosphere inside the Southridge Police Department grew chaotic. Familiar hallways began to resemble battlefields, each footstep echoing with the weight of fear. Young officers exchanged glances filled with confusion and anger as the very superiors they once looked up to were led out in handcuffs. The sight planted an unsettling question deep within them: could they still believe in the integrity of their profession when those in the same uniform had become symbols of betrayal? Conversations in break rooms faded into silence, replaced by wordless nods. Everyone knew any spoken sentence might become evidence. In the media, the phrase internal purge appeared with increasing frequency. News outlets described it as an unprecedented overhaul as a cascade of names fell in a matter of days. Citizens followed each broadcast exhaling with relief as the complicit were removed from power, yet holding on to deep skepticism. They knew this was only the beginning. There remained an intricate web yet to be unraveled. Political analysts noted that the ripple effects of this event would spread far, not just transforming one police department, but applying national pressure for broader reform. Across the streets, banners still lined the roads, but this time the chants had shifted. People no longer called only for justice for Carter, but now emphasized clean the system. They viewed the dismissals and prosecutions as an initial signal, but they wanted more. They wanted a new clean system, one where those who carry guns and badges are held accountable to the public. Marches turned into open forums where citizens passionately discussed how to oversee law enforcement, how to build safeguards so that no one like Kane could ever exist again. The wave of reckoning quickly spread to neighboring police departments. Surprise inspections were carried out, stacks of old files reviewed, and long-dismissed complaints were reopened. Many high-ranking officers began to feel their seats grow unstable, forced to testify and explain their past decision. Press conferences followed one after another, with police department spokespeople standing before rows of microphones trying to calm the public with promises. But the public wasn't easily soothed. Every promise was remembered. Every commitment became an obligation the people were determined to see honored. Kane, once the center of public outrage, had now become the spark for a larger reform. His name was no longer tied to a single act, but had become a symbol of rot laid bare. And as the purge continued to spread, it didn't just sweep away the guilty individuals, it ripped off the long-standing veil of protection, forcing the entire system to stand in front of the mirror and confront itself. In the eyes of the people, this was the real victory, not the downfall of one man, but the movement of a machine once thought immovable. The day of the final verdict arrived, and Southridge Court was packed from early morning. People lined up outside, some carrying signs, others simply standing silently, waiting for a historic moment. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick. Every quiet cough seemed unusually loud. All eyes turned toward the jury box, where tense faces prepared to read the decision after weeks of hearings. No one spoke, no one dared to breathe deeply. The entire room seemed frozen in the moment that would determine Kane's fate. The presiding judge nodded, and the jury foreman slowly stood holding a sheet of paper that trembled slightly. His voice rang out clearly. After reviewing all evidence, testimonies, and arguments, we unanimously sentenced the defendant Kane to 15 years in prison. The short sentence dropped like a weight in the room. A few sharp inhales echoed, then suddenly the entire courtroom erupted in cheers, a downpour of clapping like a summer storm. Outside, chants of justice for Carter blended with the verdict, forming a blazing chorus of justice. Kane sat motionless for a few seconds, his face pale, eyes wide in disbelief. He had hoped for a loophole, had believed his past reputation and protection would earn him leniency, but it all collapsed with a single sentence. Two officers approached, and the clicking of handcuffs rang out clearly, each metal loop sealing shut around his wrists. Kane lowered his head, his former arrogance entirely gone, replaced by the image of a man defeated and cornered. The entire room watched, many with tears in their eyes, knowing this was more than punishment for one man. It was proof that justice could still find its way. Evelyn Carter sat on the bench, her expression and calm, neither triumphant nor angry, but that of someone who knew she had fulfilled a duty. She watched Kane's every step as he was escorted out, her gaze cold but lit with the quiet conviction that her suffering had not been in vain. Carter knew this verdict would not erase the past, but it opened a door to a more just future. Her image, seated there upright and resolute facing the man who once humiliated her, would be remembered as an unshakable symbol. Cameras captured the full moment as Kane walked past Carter with his head down, unable to look her in the eye, the cuffs on his hands barely hidden beneath his gray uniform. That image was broadcast worldwide on television screens, on phones, and breaking news headlines. People saw a man who once believed himself untouchable, now bowing before the law, and that image became a powerful message. Justice, though delayed, had arrived. Applause continued to echo, stretching on until the courtroom doors finally closed, leaving behind a lasting impact on everyone's hearts. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted, tight embraces and tearful faces everywhere. Journalists rushed to file their reports, and headlines appeared across media outlets. Kane, sentenced to 15 years. Justice for Carter. Those words mark the end of a dark chapter and confirm that truth may be buried, but it cannot be destroyed. And in the hearts of millions, watching the image of Carter seated with dignity on the high bench witnessing the man who humiliated her, Bo, his head became eternal proof that the law excludes no one, not even those who believed they stood above it all. The final gavel strike had barely echoed when the courthouse plaza exploded into a sea of sound. Hundreds of people cheered, clapped, and raised signs that read "Justice for Carter" and "Law for All." The sound surged like crashing waves spilling over old brick walls and resonating inside the courtroom. People hugged each other, some wept, while groups of young protesters raised their fists to the sky, shouting until their voices were hoarse. The air was thick with emotion, a mix of triumphant joy and long-awaited release from anger that had simmered for too long. Live broadcasts captured the moment, the image of hundreds of small flags waving through the crowd, spreading across the globe, allowing millions to witness justice's return. Handheld speakers blasted rhythmic chants as thousands of voices merged into a roar. Carter, Carter. Each syllable struck like a drumbeat, shaking the ground around the courthouse. Reporters pushed through the crowd, microphones raised to catch every word. A middle-aged black woman spoke through tears. "We've waited so long for this day. This isn't just for Carter, it's for all of us," a young man added. "Justice isn't a distant dream anymore. It's right here." Their words blended with the cheers, forming a chorus of perseverance and unshakable belief. Inside, Carter quietly rose from the judge's bench. Each step down from the high wooden platform carried the weight of memory. Her eyes swept the room, seeing the faces that had remained tense for days and also the exhaustion and relief shining through the public's gaze. Her expression was proud. She had preserved her dignity, had forced an entire system to bow before justice. Yet, deep within, she felt the burden pressing on her shoulders, the burden of those still waiting for protection of the pains that had never been brought into the light. Carter walked slowly down each step, her hand brushing lightly against the cold wood. The cheers from outside echoed and making the space seem to sway, but she kept her pace steady, unhurried. In her resolute eyes there was a trace of fatigue, but also the clarity of someone who had endured a grueling test. She was not a hero built to shine. She was simply a person, one who had suffered humiliation, who had stayed silent, and finally stood up to prove that justice exists. That gaze, both proud and burdened, left an unforgettable impression on all who saw it. In the moment Carter stepped away from the bench, the chants outside the courthouse swelled with renewed force, as if to send her off with faith and gratitude. Arms lifted, high voices calling her name in unison with the beat of drums, creating a soundtrack to her steps. Cameras captured every frame, a woman with uneven cropped hair walking through radiant light, carrying both the pride and the weight of a symbol. And in that thunderous roar, Evelyn Carter was no longer just the judge of a courtroom. She had become the face of millions longing for justice. Immediately after the verdict, major city streets were filled with new banners, bold red letters reading, "Her Dignity, Our Fight," stretched across brick walls, hung in front of cafes, plastered along bus stops, and even printed on T-shirts worn by many young people. The slogan quickly spread beyond a single city, appearing in multiple states, each turning it into a shared declaration of resistance. Across the New York skyline, a massive banner was strung between two buildings, while in Los Angeles, demonstrators carried the slogan down the boulevard, their chants echoing through the city. These images, spread across social media, shared endlessly, creating a powerful wave of momentum that transformed a personal case into a social symbol. In schools, Carter's case became a lesson more vivid than any textbook. Teachers played clips of the trial, explaining to students the meaning of justice, courage, and civic duty. In one high school class, a teacher asked, "If you had been in that hallway, what would you have done?" The question brought silence. Then, hands slowly went up and students eagerly shared their thoughts. Some admitted they would have been scared, others said they would have pulled out their phones to record, while a few insisted they would have tried to speak up. That discussion helped them realize that justice isn't some distant concept, it lives in every personal choice. Many universities held forums inviting legal experts and social activists to speak. Lecture halls filled with students, the atmosphere charged like a public square. A senior law student said Carter turned silence into the strongest indictment. She didn't have to shout, but she made society listen. That quote appeared in the student newspaper and spread online, inspiring many young people to pursue careers in law or social advocacy. Out on the streets, the community art movement joined in. Murals of Carter with short hair and a resolute gaze appeared across neighborhoods. Street artists added the phrase, "Her dignity, our fight," transforming old worn walls into symbols of strength and belief. An indie band wrote a song titled "Stand with Carter," sung proudly by young crowds at public gatherings. Art, music, and media blended into a collective chorus, resonating across the community. In residential neighborhoods, parents used Carter's story to teach their children. One mother told her daughter, "You see, dignity is more important than anything. No one has the right to take that from you." A boy next door, after hearing the story, asked his father, "If it were you, would you have stood up?" These questions sparked deep reflection, helping the younger generation understand that courage begins with small, everyday actions. International media continued to praise the event, calling it a turning point in the fight for justice. Many countries included the case in human rights discussions, using Carter as an example in global conferences. The ripple effect crossed borders, proving that justice is not just a local matter, but a common banner for all of humanity. Carter did not appear often after the trial. She chose silence, but her image and story remained everywhere. The echo of her resolve went far beyond expectations, transforming her from a solitary figure in a cold hallway into a symbol of inspiration, compelling society to reflect and continue reminding one another of an irreplaceable value, human dignity. After the historic verdict, the atmosphere in the city seemed to shift day by day. Anti-discrimination forums were held continuously, from small community centers to large auditoriums. People gathered to share stories, analyze every detail, and draw lessons for themselves. Legal experts explained how to identify abuse of power. Social activists offered ways to protect one's rights, while ordinary citizens began to bravely recount personal experiences of injustice. These gatherings swung between quiet sobs as painful stories were shared and bursts of applause when someone declared they would never bow down again. The Carter case was no longer an isolated incident, but a catalyst for countless movements, bringing conversations about justice and dignity closer to everyday life. At a university forum, the lecture hall was packed with students. The moderator asked, "If you had witnessed that scene, what would you have done?" Many hands went up, voices followed one another, some admitting to having stayed silent when they saw friends treated unfairly. others affirming they would act now after being inspired by Carter. The discussion didn't end within four walls. It spread to social media, where clips were shared and commented on, generating thousands of new conversations. Schools, offices, and even businesses held similar talks, reminding everyone that every collective bears responsibility in the fight against discrimination. Amid the ongoing events, the young law student who recorded the fateful video in the courthouse hallway unexpectedly became a widely recognized figure. At first, she had simply held her phone with trembling hands, thinking only that the truth should at least be saved somewhere. But when she decided to upload it, she inadvertently sparked an entire movement. Now, the media calls her a brave whistleblower. She appeared in several interviews, her voice still shy but her eyes full of confidence. "I just thought staying silent would make us lose the only chance to prove the truth. I never imagined that decision would have such a wide impact." And the public saw her as proof that courage doesn't have to come from power status or experience, but can begin with a simple decision by an ordinary person. High school students wrote essays about her, praising the bravery of a young person who didn't turn away. Social organizations proposed awarding her, seeing her action as a symbol of civic spirit. At rallies, people held up the photo of her holding the phone as if to remind everyone that even a small device can change the course of an entire system. The appearance of the whistleblower brought even more energy to the forums. She was invited to share her feelings in the moment she pressed record when everyone else chose silence. Each time she stood to speak, the room erupted in applause, not just to encourage her, but as a thank you on behalf of all those who once couldn't speak up. Her story became a reminder that every witness matters, that justice can only be illuminated when someone dares to turn on the light. Alongside the passionate discussions and the image of the courageous law student, the social resonance of the Carter case continued to grow. It no longer stayed confined to a single city, but became a current of inspiration, crossing borders, awakening the awareness that justice must be defended through action, and that every person, no matter how small, can become the starting point of great change. After days of public uproar and constant attention, Evelyn Carter appeared for the first time at a public talk in front of hundreds of students and young activists. The large auditorium fell silent as she stepped up to the podium, no longer under the harsh lighting of the courtroom, but under the expectant eyes of those eager to hear her tell the story herself. Carter paused for a few seconds, scanning the audience before speaking slowly. The most painful thing wasn't the clippers, it was the silence. The sentence cut through the memories of everyone who had followed the case, making the whole room hold its breath. People understood then that physical wounds would eventually heal, but the turning away, the lowered heads of those who were present that day would linger far longer. She shared that in the moment of humiliation, what hurt most was not just Kane's actions, but the way everyone else chose to look away. Each averted gaze, each hand gripping a file pretending to read, felt like a sentence heavier than the sound of the clippers buzzing over her head. Carter's voice held no blame, only the quiet sorrow of someone who had endured a bitter experience. She admitted that she closed her eyes not out of fear, but to remember the moment of silence so that later, when telling the story, she could show the next generation that silence is the fertile ground where injustice grows. The room stayed quiet until a young student suddenly stood up, voice trembling but firm. "We won't let that happen again." The promise echoed, leaving many teary-eyed. Carter nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips, though her eyes stayed serious. She continued, "Never stay silent in the face of injustice. You may be scared, you may hesitate, but silence only makes the oppressor stronger. If one person speaks up, a second will follow, then a third. That's how justice is built, by the smallest voices." Applause thundered, but Carter remained calm in tone. She didn't paint herself as a hero, but only emphasized that anyone can be the first spark. She spoke of the law student who had bravely filmed the video, saying that her trembling hands had been the beginning of an entire movement. She stressed that change doesn't come from grand speeches, but from the quiet actions of ordinary people who choose not to look away. Students in the audience listened, some taking notes, others simply watching Carter with admiration. For them, her confession wasn't just a personal story, but a reminder that justice doesn't arrive on its own. It must be claimed through courage and resolve. Carter ended the session with a short but powerful statement. If just one of them had stood up that day, I wouldn't have had to endure it alone. Remember, injustice only wins when we stay silent. The entire auditorium rose to its feet, the applause thundering on without pause. The image of the woman with short hair, bright eyes, and a steady low voice was etched into the minds of everyone present. Her confession wasn't meant to mourn, but to ignite, to ensure that from this moment forward, every young generation would step into the world knowing they had a duty to speak up, that silence is never the answer. Evelyn Carter's final words echoed through the hall like a wake-up call. As she finished speaking, rows of students in the audience rose together, eyes glowing with emotion. The applause grew louder, starting as scattered claps before joining into a continuous, unified wave. The air, once heavy with memories of humiliation and injustice, now surged with collective strength as if every clap struck against the silence that had once weighed on Carter's heart. Their response wasn't born of pity, but recognition. They saw themselves in her story and understood that her painful experience had handed them a responsibility they could no longer ignore. A group of students in the front rows began chanting, "Stand up, speak out." The cry rang loud and powerful, quickly picked up by the entire auditorium, bouncing off the walls, echoing across the tiled floor, and reaching every corner of the room. Within minutes, the chant became a rhythm, a shared anthem. Carter stood still, overwhelmed by the scene before her, her gaze filled with a complex blend of pride, relief, and bittersweet emotion. The memories of silence in that courthouse hallway were now replaced by this blazing chorus, a declaration that silence was no longer an option for the youth. Amid the chants, tears began to fall. A high school girl, standing beside her friend, clapped while crying, raising her fist to affirm her belief. A male law student shouted at the top of his lungs, face flushed red, as if releasing all the fury he had once bottled up after watching the video of Carter's humiliation. They didn't need to be direct witnesses. They chose to turn emotion into action, to turn the lesson into a vow. Every cry of "stand up, speak out" wasn't just encouragement for Carter, but a personal commitment not to repeat the silence of the past. Carter didn't silence the chant. She simply stood still, eyes fixed on the crowd. Her short hair, squared shoulders, and the chorus of young voices formed a powerful image. She knew she couldn't erase the pain of the past, but she could pass it on as fuel for the future. And seeing the hundreds of youthful faces echoing the chant over and over, she knew the humiliation she once endured was no longer meaningless. It had been transformed into a new force, bigger, stronger, and lasting. As the talk ended, students lingered outside, gathering in small groups, continuing to chant, "Stand up, speak out," as if trying to etch it into everyone's memory. Reporters captured the scene, airing it on television and social media, where it instantly went viral. Within a single night, the slogan appeared on thousands of signs, scribbled on sticky notes across dorm walls, and even as the title of editorials. Its reach grew so powerfully that the phrase became a message of its time, no longer tied to a single trial or event, but serving as a compass for anyone facing injustice. That night, Carter sat quietly in her small room watching clips of students chanting the slogan. Her face wasn't beaming, but her eyes held a steady light of conviction. She knew that what she had endured, however bitter, had not been forgotten. As the chant, "Stand up, speak out," echoed through the streets, she realized that justice was no longer hers alone to carry. It had been passed on to a new generation, one that had promised never to let silence become an accomplice again. After Kane's trial, the aftershocks didn't stop at one city. Pressure from the public media and human rights organizations built into a storm that swept across the country. Police departments in several states were forced to release complaint records from the past 10 years, something that had never happened before. Filing cabinets, once locked keys were opened, and dusty stacks of paper became undeniable proof of truths long buried. People flooded newly created websites to search and read through dry lines of text that concealed forgotten injustices. Some trembled upon finding a loved one's name among the victims. Others sat in stunned silence, realizing how they had been misled for years by a system of silence. This new transparency sparked fierce debate. Some veteran officers protested, arguing that disclosure would harm the force's reputation, but their voices were quickly drowned by the rising tide of public demand. People no longer accepted tired excuses. They wanted the truth to be seen so trust could be rebuilt. Legal experts called it a document revolution, where records stopped being tools for cover-ups and instead became the foundation for restoring trust between citizens and law enforcement. Alongside document transparency, a wave of reforms followed. Anti-racism training became mandatory across the entire police system. No longer dry lectures, the courses now feature real-world scenarios using cases like Carter's as key examples. Recruits had to learn how to identify bias in behavior, how to intervene when colleagues cross the line, and how to take personal responsibility when faced with injustice. Active duty officers were also required to undergo retraining. No one was exempt. At many police academies, the atmosphere shifted visibly. Posters, read and stand up, speak out were plastered along hallways, and instructors repeated that silence was a form of complicity. In class, cadets engaged in heated debates about how to respond in real-life situations. Some argued for strict action, others emphasized the power of dialogue. These arguments, though unresolved, showed that the Carter case had struck at the root of the problem, forcing an entire new generation of officers to confront their values. On national television, the Attorney General appeared at a press conference declaring that every police department must now undergo independent oversight. He stated clearly, "We cannot allow another Kane to emerge. This is not only the responsibility of law enforcement, but of the entire nation to protect human dignity." The statement was broadcast live, and millions applauded in agreement. In that moment, the public felt their voices had finally been heard, that the marches, the fiery slogans on the streets had truly sparked change. The Carter incident, once thought to be a small event in a courthouse hallway, had become the catalyst for a sweeping reform. Police departments across the country were forced to reassess their operations to be transparent with the public and to retrain their personnel. It was a nationwide wake-up call, a reminder that justice cannot be dismissed, that the wounds of the past can only heal through transparency and deep-rooted change. As the order for document transparency rolled out across the country, attention turned not only to the officers directly involved in misconduct, but also to those who had once held command. Some high-ranking officials, long considered untouchable, now faced intense scrutiny. Old reports were reopened, and every signature they once approved became evidence used to question their responsibility. Public hearings were held where those who once wore heavy insignia on their shoulders had to answer directly in front of cameras, explaining why their subordinates' wrongdoings were ignored. Many powerful faces began to show visible strain. They were no longer speaking from podiums with authoritative tones, but fumbling through explanations, clarifying oversights, and justifying cover-ups. The press called it a turning point. Oversight had finally reached the root, cracking open the wall of silence that had stood for years. This review triggered a chain reaction. In many states, lists of high-ranking officers under investigation were published from New Jersey to Texas, from Florida to California. Names that once graced front pages alongside commanding portraits now reappeared in headlines stamped with the word investigated. The public watched with a mix of shock and satisfaction, realizing that justice had finally reached the upper echelons of power. Oversight was no longer confined to a few isolated individuals. It had become a new rule: anyone who had allowed injustice to thrive would be held accountable. The domino effect quickly spread across the United States. In Chicago, a flood of complaint records was unsealed, prompting the review of numerous old cases. In Atlanta, the City Hall ordered the formation of an independent group to oversee the city's police force. Something that had long been a slogan was now enforced by resolution. Los Angeles witnessed community meetings more crowded than ever, with residents packing halls to ask questions and demand transparency from area officers. In more remote areas, small towns began to follow suit, holding public forums where citizens shared their experiences, turning what once seemed like isolated stories into collective evidence. Social media became the bridge connecting these reforms. People posted images of local police officers being questioned, tagged with the new slogan, "Accountability Everywhere." The phrase appeared in videos, political cartoons, and street protests. Its momentum grew so strong that several politicians were compelled to speak up, acknowledging that reform in law enforcement was no longer optional, but an urgent demand. Heated debates erupted in Congress centered on this issue, but for the first time, a majority of lawmakers realized they could no longer ignore the pressure from society. As the domino effect swept through the country, it wasn't only officers who were held accountable. The public itself was awakened. Citizens became more aware of their right to speak out, more willing to challenge injustice instead of quietly accepting it. Schools added lessons on justice and human rights to their curricula, and nonprofit organizations expanded their oversight efforts. From major cities to small towns, the collective atmosphere shifted. Silence was no longer an acceptable choice. And in the midst of that transformation, Carter's story was retold as the beginning of an unprecedented movement, one that forced an entire nation to confront its own fractures in order to begin repairing them. Months after Kane's sentencing, American society continued to speak Carter's name as a symbol. It didn't stop at news reports or protests. Her name was officially written into law through a new provision designed to protect citizens from abuse of power by law enforcement. Lawmakers called it the Carter Amendment, emphasizing that it was created so no one would have to endure what she did. In law classrooms, students studied the case not only for its legal implications, but to understand that the law must be tied to human dignity. Each time Carter's name echoed through lecture halls, students were reminded that one woman had turned silence into evidence, humiliation into a turning point for systemic change. At the same time, a support fund for victims of racial discrimination was founded, named the Carter Foundation for Justice. It received contributions from thousands of citizens, businesses, and public figures. The fund's mission was not only to provide legal aid for vulnerable victims, but also to sponsor education programs and raise awareness in communities. Small offices opened in many cities where anyone who had suffered injustice could share their story and receive the help they needed. Carter's short hair and determined gaze appeared on posters throughout the foundation's offices, becoming a symbol of protection and hope. People saw the foundation as a living legacy of the case because it ensured Carter's story didn't end with Kane's conviction, it turned pain into action. Many families affected by injustice came forward. Some shared their experiences for the first time, and others found justice after years of being ignored. A mother who lost her son in a police-related incident said through tears when receiving help from the foundation, "I can't get my child back, but because of Carter, I know my pain has meaning." Her words resonated with the public, deepening Carter's legacy. In the media, her name appeared alongside civil rights leaders who had changed history. Historians affirmed that Carter had extended the path of justice, turning a personal ordeal into a wake-up call for an entire nation. Documentaries documentaries were produced, publishers released books recounting the story, not only to preserve the past, but to inspire the future. Each time Carter's image appeared on screen, audiences were met with a familiar message: dignity cannot be taken away. At community award ceremonies, Carter was often absent, choosing silence for herself, but her name was always mentioned as a gesture of gratitude. People honored her as a living witness, a symbol of courage. The legacy she left behind didn't lie under the spotlight, but in the law books that were changed in the support foundations operating every day, and in the belief held by millions that justice may be slow, but it will always arrive. The Carter case concluded with tangible actions, and that's what made it a lasting legacy. Her name wasn't confined to a single moment, but etched into the legal and social history and into the minds of the people. From pages of law textbooks to the modest offices of the foundation to everyday reminders, Carter left future generations a clear lesson: justice does not only exist in courtrooms, it lives in every brave act and in the persistent defense of human dignity. The case surrounding Carter quickly became an inspiration for numerous documentaries. Filmmakers recreated key moments from the courthouse hallway where the sound of clippers sliced through her hair to the overturned trial where Kane bowed his head in handcuffs. These images were retold through the perspectives of witnesses, the public, and even those who once stayed silent, painting an honest picture of injustice and a society's awakening. The press joined in with a flood of editorials, memoirs, and interviews recounting the story from many angles. Some journalists went to great lengths to collect old files, testimonies, and even personal journals of those present to construct a comprehensive narrative. Each article, each film emphasized the same point. Carter's courage and resolve transformed a personal humiliation into a turning point for societal change. That influence didn't stop at media, it ran deep into the minds of younger generations. In classrooms, Carter's image was brought into lessons as a vivid example of resilience. Teachers didn't just teach the law, they taught life values using Carter as proof that one person can start a movement. Students drew pictures, wrote essays, and created projects centered on her, using her as a mirror to reflect on their own choices. At universities, students hosted forums under the theme Carter and the Responsibility of a New Generation, debating how to confront injustice in modern life. These conversations spread, turning Carter into a spiritual beacon for young people, reminding them that courage is never outdated. On social media, Carter's image was crafted into a symbol, appearing on T-shirts, posters, and even in human rights campaigns. Satirical drawings depicting Kane's downfall were placed alongside Carter's proud portrait, creating a sharp contrast between darkness and light. Young people shared these images with pride, treating them as a declaration of a proactive attitude toward life, one that refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice. Carter was no longer just a character in a story. She had become a cross-generational icon, a reminder that justice must be defended through the actions of individuals. Many scholars referred to this as the Carter effect, when a single event becomes a shared lesson for society as a whole. They compared her to historic figures who sparked major movements and suggested that the new generation saw in her a flame to fuel their spirit of resistance. One female law student wrote in her thesis, "I want to become a lawyer, not to win cases, but to protect human dignity like Carter did." That sentence was quoted repeatedly and spread widely, proving that Carter's legacy did not reside in legal texts or headlines, but thrived in the dreams of the youth. The new generation saw Carter as a standard of integrity and resilience. They learned to stand up when needed, to speak out instead of staying silent, to believe that even a small voice can shift the outcome. And in that very process, Carter's story continued to live, not just as the memory of a shocking case, but as a flame passed from one generation to the next, reminding them that justice, once awakened, will never die out. At a ceremony held in the central square, thousands gathered under the golden lights, waiting for the moment Evelyn Carter would step onto the stage. The air was still, every eye fixed on the woman with short hair and resolute gaze who had become a symbol. As the microphone was handed to her, Carter lifted her head, her voice clear in the night. Justice is not only in the law, but in our actions. The words echoed, bouncing off the walls, flowing through the streets, stirring every heart present. It was more than a statement, it was a message, a promise to the current and future generations that justice does not end with written law, but begins with each person's choices. In that moment, the square fell into absolute silence. No applause, no chants, only the sound of wind brushing against fluttering banners. The silence was full of reflection, as if everyone was looking inward through Carter's words, asking themselves if they had ever turned away, ever missed a chance to speak up. Thousands of faces looked toward the stage, their eyes shining in the lights, the entire space suspended by the weight of that message. Then, suddenly, someone from the front row stood up. Immediately, others followed until a wave of people rose from the heart of the square to its furthest corners. The sound of plastic chairs scraping the ground rang out, then stopped, leaving behind the sight of thousands standing still silently facing Carter. That act needed no words, no slogans, yet it became the most powerful affirmation of what she had just said. Justice begins with action, with the choice not to sit still in the face of injustice. Carter's eyes softened for a moment, then lit up with renewed belief. She saw in the crowd faces of all ages, workers, students, parents, holding children, standing together as one. She understood she was no longer alone, that what she had endured had become a flame igniting something in millions of others. Tears fell from the eyes of many, but they weren't tears of pain, they were tears of awakening. Reporters on site rushed to record the rare sight, broadcasting it to the world. TV screens, phones, and social media were filled with the image of thousands standing tall in the night beneath Carter's word. Statuses poured in. I stood up. Did you? That image became a collective vow, a declaration that silence would never again be the answer. Carter stepped away from the microphone without another word, simply bowing her head, her shoulders lighter as if shedding a burden carried for years. She descended the steps, her eyes still fixed on the motionless crowd, and a determined smile briefly appeared. From that moment on, she was no longer just a judge in a courtroom, no longer just a victim in a video, but had become a living symbol of the pursuit of justice. That night, the entire square pulsed with a shared heartbeat, leaving behind an indelible message: justice will not arrive on its own if people don't act, and silence will always be complicit. Evelyn Carter had spoken, and thousands had risen to prove they understood. Since the night, the square lit up with applause, and the collective act of standing the image of Evelyn Carter with her short hair gradually became a symbol of resilience. Across city streets, murals of her face with bright eyes and resolute features began appearing each wall, a quiet reminder of the fight against injustice. Young people turned that image into a media icon, printing it on shirts, badges, and even using it as their social media profile pictures. The short hair, once cut in humiliation, had transformed into a mark of strength, a visual story that human dignity can never be diminished. Articles, magazines, and documentaries revisiting the case all chose Carter's short-haired portrait as the central poster. It was no longer a scar of pain, but a declaration that suffering can be turned into a flame of inspiration. When people spoke of her, they didn't only mention the judge who shook the system, they spoke of a woman who stood for all those who had been shamed but rose anyway. On the streets, children shouted, "That's Carter," when passing a large mural, and their parents smiled, knowing that memory would become a powerful lesson for the next generation. At many community events, when the symbol of short hair was raised, chants echoed together, forming a collective strength. People no longer looked at it with pity, but with respect, understanding that behind the symbol was a story of endurance, of turning humiliation into power that changed society. From school forums to massive marches, Carter's image stood as living proof that one individual can transform an entire community. In her final appearance before the media, Carter stood silent for a few seconds at the microphone, her short hair glowing under the lights, her face calm, but her eyes ablaze. She spoke with clarity and firmness. "No power has the right to humiliate a human being." The words echoed through the auditorium, broadcast live to millions, repeated across the country like a vow. It was no longer just a judge's statement, it was the closing message of a turbulent era. The audience paused in silence to let the words sink in, then erupted into prolonged applause. Those present felt they had just heard a simple truth strong enough to serve as a pillar for any society. That message became a widely quoted line printed on book covers, posted in classrooms, and featured on signs at social movements. It served as a reminder that regardless of the time or who holds power, human dignity remains untouchable. Carter stepped off the stage under the gaze of thousands, needing no more words because the message was already clear, powerful, and far-reaching. From that day on, her short hair and that statement were passed down like a warning, a compass for those still fighting injustice. And in society's collective memory, Evelyn Carter would forever be remembered not just as a judge, but as a symbol of defiance, the one who turned humiliation into an enduring message of justice. As the final lights from the square ceremony dimmed, the story of Evelyn Carter closed like a turbulent book that left a lasting echo in every heart. From a moment of humiliation in a courthouse hallway, she turned her endurance into a flame that illuminated an entire system, forcing the public to confront the truth and pushing society toward change. Carter chose not to react with anger. She stayed silent, letting the moment reveal itself, then turned that silence into evidence, into a call that no one could ignore. Her journey from victim to symbol showed that dignity, when defended with conviction and faith, can become a force powerful enough to change history. Everything that followed the wave of outrage, Kane's downfall, the reforms that swept the country, was the result of that conviction. Carter proved that even a seemingly small act could spark a seismic shift. When the video was released, it didn't just expose one man, it ignited a spirit of resistance across society. During the trial, she didn't need grand arguments. One look was enough to make her abuser bow his head. And when she delivered her final message, justice lives not only in law, but in our actions, she passed that flame to millions, turning it into a collective promise. What lingers most deeply from this story is the lesson about silence. Carter once admitted that her greatest pain wasn't the act of violence itself, but the turning away of those who witnessed it. That's why she urged young people never stay silent in the face of injustice, because when one person speaks up, a second will follow, and soon an entire community will rise. That lesson wasn't just for the students in the auditorium that day, but for anyone who has ever hesitated between speaking out and choosing the safety of silence. The image of Carter, with her short hair and resolute eyes, has gone beyond the limits of a personal story to become a social symbol. It reminds us that humiliation can be transformed into strength, that what once seemed like a mark of pain can become a symbol of belief and dignity. The new generation sees in her a role model, learning to speak up, to take responsibility, and to believe that justice must be defended through real action. And when thousands stood together chanting, "Stand up, speak I out," they proved Carter's lesson had moved beyond words, becoming collective action. Carter's legacy lies not only in the verdict against Kane or the reforms in law enforcement, but in the shift in individual awareness. People now understand that justice isn't a gift handed down, but the result of courage and perseverance. Young generations know that silence is the breeding ground for injustice, and that even a small act can ripple far beyond imagination. Support funds were established, new laws were passed, but more importantly, a renewed belief was planted in people's hearts. Human dignity is untouchable. The story of Evelyn Carter ends with a message that is simple but eternal. No power has the right to humiliate a human being. It's a reminder to those in power that they are not above the law, and an encouragement to ordinary people that they always have the right to speak up. Carter Carter walked through the dark hallway of humiliation and emerged into the light of justice, leaving behind a legacy that will not fade. That legacy will continue to echo not just in law books on walls or in public forums, but in the hearts of all who believe that justice, when defended with courage and conviction, will never disappear.